Okay, good afternoon, students. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon.
So, we will start with the lecture now. So, in previous lecture, we have started with constructor. Uh, we have just gone through what do you mean by constructor, what is need of this constructor. So, basically, constructors are used to initialize the object as well as whatever objects we are declaring to destroy those objects. We need to do it manually. Okay, so there is no provision like variables. Whenever variable goes out of scope, automatically those variables get destroyed. So objects will not be automatically destroyed, and that is why the constructor. So for every constructor, we need to define the destructor so that that particular object get destroyed. Okay. So that is the use of learning this constructor and destructor. Okay. So we have just gone through three different types of constructor. That is default constructor, parameterized constructor, and the uh, copy constructor. So out of these three types, we have just gone through default and parameterized. So today we'll discuss this copy constructor also. Okay. So before starting with the constructor, few characteristics of constructors we will divide. So I told you the three main points to remember related to constructor. So constructor is a special function which has same name as the class name as represented here in the first this statement. Okay, so constructor should have same name as the class name. So constructor should be defined within the public section. Constructor should not return any value. Okay, so these 3 points I asked you to remember. So it should not return any value, and hence we are not using any return type for the constructors. Okay, even the void cannot be used to represent that constructor is not returning any value. We know constructors are used to initialize the object, and hence it is not returning anything, and hence even void cannot be used to represent the constructor. Okay, so constructors are automatically invoked. Okay, so when objects are created, and this is applicable for your default constructor. Even for parameterized constructor and copy constructor, we need to provide the values. Okay, so that your constructors can be automatically invoked, automatically called. Okay, and your objects will be created or initialized. Okay, so these are the things like constructors cannot be inherited, so that we will see in inheritance. Okay, so right now you can simply remember constructors cannot be inherited. They can have default arguments. This we'll discuss today. Okay, constructor can have default argument. Just like we have seen that the parameters of a function can provide the default values. Similarly, your constructor parameters can be assigned the default values. Okay, so constructors cannot be virtual. Again, what is virtual function that we have not studied? So your constructors cannot be defined as a virtual function. So you simply remember this. It cannot be inherited. It cannot be virtual function. Okay, we cannot refer to their address. Okay, so usually we can find out where exactly our subroutine or a function or a module is stored. So in case of constructors, we cannot refer to their address also. Okay, an object with a constructor or destructor cannot be used as a member of a union. Okay, so objects with constructor and destructor cannot be declared as a member of a union. Okay, So they make implicit calls to the operator new and delete when memory allocation is required. So that is where I just, this is implicit call to new means you might have just remember, you can recall even those who have implemented uh, third experiment. Okay, so here you can recall we are not using any keyword new to explicitly call our parameterized constructor. So usually, so it will be written, so if you are using that new, it is called as dynamic memory allocation. At runtime that object will be allocated the memory. Okay. So whereas the interpretation of this is we are explicitly calling that one, and internally actually it is using that new operator. So there is no need to call it or use that, add that new operator to create an object. Okay. So that is what here the meaning of this implicit call to new and delete operator. So automatically when constructor is called, so it will be allocating memory with the help of new operator internally and delete operator for destroying that particular object. It is using the delete operator. Okay, so implicit call to new and delete is taking place for memory allocation and reallocation of an object. Okay, so out of these, actually, uh, initial 5 to 6 points you need to remember related to constructor. Okay, should have same name as the class name. Should not. It should be declared within public section. It cannot be declared within private, because the basic use of constructor is to initialize an object, and if you are defining that in a private section, we cannot have access to that particular constructor. Okay, and hence it should be declared in a public section. It will be automatically invoked when the objects are created. So there is no need to explicitly call that particular constructor. Okay, so they do not have any return type. Not even void can be used to declare, to define the constructor or destructor. Okay, so they cannot be inherited. The arguments can be initialized to some default values. Okay, and constructor cannot be virtual, cannot refer to any address to where exactly that constructor is stored. So that cannot, that address cannot be opted. Okay, object with a constructor destructor can be used as, cannot be used as a member of a union. Okay, and they make implicit call to operator new and delete when memory allocation is required. So these are few things which are also called as the characteristics or the properties of a constructor. Okay, and those we already discussed. Okay, now parameterized constructor also we have done. The constructor which has parameter which has some argument, okay, are called as parameterized constructor. So here are the two different ways in which we can initialize or call that parameterized constructor. Actually this is integer, and here the example is used. Actually this is the class, this is parameterized, this is default constructor syntax. Okay, declaration of default constructor, and this is how your default constructor can be initialized, can be defined outside the class integer. Okay, and for the same integer, here the integer parameterized constructor is used. Actually, as what I wanted to show is this should be integer. Okay, integer, and that parameterized constructor integer can be called by just writing the same thing. Integer is an object for that integer equals to, we are calling the uh, constructor integer by passing x value for that x, and through that x n will be initialized. Okay, so this is your parameterized constructor, or you can initialize this. There are actually two parameters. So your integer constructor should have two parameters, int y. Okay. So n and m, two values we have to initialize, two data members of a class. So m will be y and 0 comma 50, which was written earlier, is correct. Okay, so this is where we are making explicit call to constructor integer by using this equals to symbol. Okay, so integer is an object for that class integer, and we are calling this uh, parameterized constructor to initialize object e. Okay, whereas here the same thing is done. Okay, so your integer object e, okay, is initialized by simply implicit call to that parameterized constructor, where we are not writing integer explicitly here, but simply passing the values corresponding to x and y as a parameter to this constructor call. Okay, and through those values your m and n will be initialized. Okay, so just to recall, I'll show you what you have done. So we have written constructor for this class box. Okay, and actually this we will discuss afterwards. We have defined, we have just gone through our default constructor, and after default constructor we have discussed this parameterized constructor. So the three data members of this class box we have initialized through this parameterized constructor, and this is how your box will be called. I have executed and shown you the output for this. Okay, so implicit call to your constructor. Here also it is implicit call to constructor. Okay, so parameterized constructor, whereas this particular example is representing explicit call to your parameterized constructor. Okay, so the same thing in that presentation, it is represented using integer example. Okay, so till this we have finished in the last lecture, and also I think I have shown this destructor, but destructor we will discuss once we finished with the copy constructor. Okay, now coming to the third type of constructor. So the third type of constructor is called as copy constructor. So copy constructor is one whose argument is the reference of the reference object for of same class. Okay, so the parameter that we are passing is nothing but it's a reference of an object of the same class. So you can just see the parameter is box ampersand symbol. So ampersand is representing, so it's a reference variable. It is taking as the reference of an object, okay, of its own class. Okay, and this is how we are initializing. H will be initialized to is the reference object. Okay, so I can write that as ampersand b. So here b is an object. Okay, b is a reference of an object, and hence we are assigning h as b dot h, w equals to b dot w. So here I want you to recall the concept of reference variable. So whenever reference variable is passed as an parameter, so it will be simply declared as a reference variable, but it will be processed just like a normal variable. Similarly, so ampersand b is representing the reference object. Okay, so it's a reference variable for an object b. Okay, and as it is reference, so it will be processed just like a normal object. Okay, just like a normal class variable we will just it's representing a reference variable of class box, and as it is reference variables are simply declared as a reference variable but processed like a normal variable. So we are using that object to initialize the data members of class box. Okay, so in short, to just define here uh, the copy constructor. The argument of the copy constructor is always a reference of an object of the same class. Okay, so here I think I'll show you the syntax. It will be clear to you. Copy constructor. So this is the syntax: class name and the reference variable of the same class we are passing as the argument. So it takes reference to an object of the same class as an argument. Okay. So that is called as copy constructor. So whenever a constructor is taking reference of an object of its own class, so that particular constructor is called as the copy constructor. Okay, and this is how the parameters can be initialized through the copy constructor. Now I'll call, we will use that constructor here. Okay, so okay, I'll define, this is the previous program. Now here we will define our copy constructor part. So to parameterize constructor, there are two ways to call this copy constructor. I will use this B1, okay, and in bracket, if you have to call that copy constructor, in bracket, I am just passing an object as a parameter to this copy constructor. Okay, so if I am passing any one object, okay, suppose OB, okay, so this whatever are the values of OB, okay, get copied into this B1. So OB, the reference of OB is assigned to this object B, okay, reference variable B, and it will be, that is nothing but it's an alias for this object OB. Okay, I'll try to represent that using just this. Okay, so what we have done actually is we have given, okay, a reference of OB. So here we have called that uh, copy constructor. Okay, so that means we have already created this object OB. Okay, not taking. Okay, so I'll just explain you here. So what we have done is we have called that this is the object for B1, and this object is getting initialized through an parameter object. Okay, so and before this object is initialized like, sorry, so it will be initialized like OB, and by passing three parameters A comma B comma C, okay, we have initialized this object. So when you declare that first line, it will create an object OB. It will allocate the memory for H, W, and D, and the value of H is nothing but A, value of W is B, and D is C. Okay, so this is how your object is initialized, and now we are passing that object as a parameter for this to initialize this another object B1. Okay, and how we have defined that constructor, copy constructor is box ampersand B is defined. So that means this B is nothing but it's a reference variable corresponding to this object OB. Okay, so that means we are assigning or giving another name to this existing object OB, which is nothing but B. And now you can see this B as well as OB both are referring to the same object. Okay, and through that object now we are initializing these three parameters like B dot W. So when you say B dot W, so it is accessing this particular value, okay, to initialize the values of your object B1. Okay, so B1 will be initialized, or this is where we are passing this object as a reference variable as an argument for this B1. Okay, and through that B dot W, your W will be initialized. So here that call to this copy constructor is taking place. So B dot H and B dot D. Okay, so these values is nothing but we are initializing this W, H and D or HWD. So the values corresponding to your object B1 is getting initialized through this copy constructor. Okay. Now the question is why there is need to pass reference of an object for a copy constructor. Okay. So we have to pass reference of an object. Otherwise, what it will do is to copy this values of object OB into another object B. So it will call the same copy constructor again. So to copy, so it will call itself. That means again the parameter is B. So this I will try to explain you. So how many of you can understand if we don't write this ampersand here, if we don't use the parameter of copy constructor as a reference variable, so we need to copy these values of OB into B. Okay, so that is nothing but it will be simply copying these values into B, and to copy these values from this object to this object, it is taking help of the same copy constructor. Okay, so that means again there is no terminating condition. Again that values to call that copy constructor means it keep on calling itself. Okay, to copy the values of one object into another object that is defined as a parameter for that copy constructor. If it is not a reference variable, it simply keep on calling itself. Okay, so and it will be a continuous process. It will be an infinite process resulting into a loophole which cannot terminate or which cannot stop the program. So it simply keep on copying, calling the same copy constructor to copy one values of one object into another object. Okay, and that is how it results into an infinite loop. And just to avoid that, the parameter, the argument that we are passing for this copy constructor should be the reference variable. So intentionally, finally, you have to simply remember that in case of copy constructor, the argument of that copy constructor is the reference variable of the same object. Okay, and it will be called something like this. It will be defined like passing object reference variable of a object. Okay, so and here it will be simply called by passing an object as a parameter to that to initialize another object B1. Okay, so this is one way. Another way you can initialize by calling by just writing here B2 equals to B1. Okay, so this is another way where copy constructor will be called. I'll just write here. In this case, the copy constructor, okay, as well as in the second statement also, the copy constructor called implicitly. Okay, so copy constructor is getting called in both the cases. But if I try to write here, like your box OB3 is already declared. Okay, so if I try to write OB3 equals to, okay, so here it will copy the content of B2 into OB3, but here your copy constructor will not be called. There the member by member copying of one object into another object is taking place. I hope you understood the difference between line number 64 and 65. So in 64, we are declaring a new object and trying to initialize that B2 object with the values of B1. Okay. Whereas here, your object is already created, and in that object, we are trying to copy the values of B2. So in this case, the copying is taking place value by value, whereas in line number 63 and 64, your copy constructor is used to copy the values of one object into another object. So here the B1 is getting initialized to object values of OB, B2 is getting initialized to B1, and here OB3 is getting initialized to B2, but copy constructor is not called. Okay, it is not called. I hope it is clear. The syntax is pretty simple. We are simply passing here reference variable of an object, okay, as a parameter, as an argument for copy constructor, and through that reference variable, we are initializing the data members of a class. And once it is declared, so this is known as your copy constructor. Okay, definition for copy constructor. And once it is declared, so it can be called like here. Okay, so to initialize your B1 object, B2 object, as well as OB3. Okay, now I'll just call here, as we have initialized B1, I will call this display, and what display is doing is it is displaying the values of H, W, and D as well as volume for that particular object. And we know now B1, B2, OB, and OB3, all these object values are same because those are initialized through copy constructor. Not the last one, but last one is getting values of B2, which are same as B1. Okay, and B1 is same as OB object. So B2 dot display. I hope it is clear. Copy constructor. I have not confused you. And just execute so that if there is any confusion, it will be avoided. Okay. Copy constructor. B1, the parameter, just like here we have defined three different values, float values. To initialize here one object, we are making use of another object, and this object will be represented as a reference variable in case of copy constructor. So that is the only thing you need to remember. Okay. So this is as good as through one object we are trying to initialize another object, and that is what is the concept of copy constructor. That's all. Okay, I'm getting here some error that we will discuss. Okay, so right now to avoid that, I'll just pass three values here. And what is happening? One is cannot bind non-constant values of box copy constructor. Okay, I'll just change that to implicit call to copy constructor. Okay. So here now what I'll just tell you, OB3 we have initialized to all 0. O object is initialized to 10, 20, 30. Okay. Object OB is initialized to user defined values ABC. OB1 is also initialized to user defined values ABC. So through parameterized constructor, and then we displayed all those values, and here we are trying to call copy constructor. Okay, so I'll just write here to differentiate from where the copy constructor is being call to copy constructor. Okay, and then we will just check the output. Okay, so after this call to copy constructor, all values should be same. All the values those are getting displayed should be same, because through one object we are trying to initialize another object. So all three statements representing the same thing, but first two make use of copy constructor, and the last statement is just copying the values member by member. Okay, so here we have to some values like 4 and 7. So again, one more object is getting initialized, and you can just see here initial all this displays three values, three object values are getting displayed. Okay, and here we are calling that copy constructor. Okay, so for this copy constructor, what is the value that we are passing as argument is the object OB. So through this OB B1 we want to initialize, and when you call this B1 dot display, which is the first display statement after call to copy constructor, you can see it is displaying the same values as that of object 1. Okay, so here is your object 1. Okay, so the same display is done here. Okay, so height, width and depth is same value. Again, as B1 is same, B1 we are copying into B2. So the next statement is also giving us the same values. Okay, and the third one is through this B2 we are trying to initialize object B3, where the member by member copy is taking place, and hence OB3 dot display also gives us the same values. Okay, so this is how your copy constructor can be used to copy the one object values into another object. Is that clear? Copy constructor? Yes, please. I hope it is clear to everyone. Copy constructor. So this way we have finished with three types of constructor. And now coming to somewhere one error you might have observed here, when I declared simply here the values. Okay, so and if we try to compile, here there are only two constructors defined. One is the parameterized constructor and another one is the copy constructor. Okay, and in this case if I try to build this, I am getting error for this declaration. Okay, so that is representing, so this is when you simply declare, so it will search for the default constructor, and in our definition there is no default constructor. And if you are not using default constructor and trying to declare an object anywhere in any function or main function, okay, so it will give you an error that default constructor is missing, no matching function for call to this particular object. Okay, so this can be avoided in two ways. You can just pass three parameters. That means you have to call this parameterized constructor by passing parameter values as we have done. Okay, so this is one solution. Another solution is you have to provide the definition for default constructor. Okay, and as you know There is no need to call this. It get automatically called for all the declarations. So that means you have to provide default constructor representing the default values for these three parameters. Okay. So I'm giving 0 as the value for this. Okay. You can see we have just added this definition, default constructor definition, in the public section of a class, and you can check your this declaration, whatever error we are getting will be removed by including the default constructor. Okay, so this is one solution. Another solution we can say is that we can go for the default values of your constructor. Okay, parameterized constructor. That means you have to define default values for all the variables of that particular parameterized constructors. Okay, so all the rules which are applicable to assign these default values for any function is applicable over here. That means you can skip assigning default values to the leftmost variable. Okay, so values can be assigned, default values can be assigned to the either to all the variables, or if you want to assign to few, it should be from the rightmost variable. You can keep on assigning those values. So I can initialize either only the last variable, last two variables, last three variables, like that. So avoid declaration of default, okay, and want to declare simply variables here without passing any values to that particular object. So that can be done using assigning here default values. So by default, your OB3 will consider, it will call that parameterized constructor by assuming these are the initial values for x, y, z. Okay, so it will be considered as we have not passing any value, but by default, the default values will be considered. So it will call that parameterized constructor with the default values which are provided for that parameterized constructor. Okay, so this is another way to avoid that error that we are getting initially. No function, no matching function we are getting for this particular object call. Okay, for object creation. Okay, so this is how you can avoid that one. So by default, the initial values will be 0, 0, 0 for object 3. Okay, I hope it is clear. So this is how parameterized constructor with default values can be defined. Okay, if I skip one of the value, again as usual you need to specify that value. At least one value you need to pass to this particular object declaration. In that case, object declaration will be uh, some value of x, and yz will be considered as the default values. Okay, but we want to complete avoid, so we will initialize all three so that not a single value we need to particular object declaration. Okay, so this is how you can avoid. And the third thing, we can have these multiple definitions. We can have these multiple definitions within of a constructor within the same class. Okay, so that is known as, again see here I'm getting this error. Okay, if you are giving default constructor as well as default values, so it may give you error. Okay, so in that case you can just go for either definition of default constructor or the default values. Okay, so it will be simply uh, just redefining the same thing. It is happening. Okay, so the last point related to this constructor is we have defined here more than one definition for the constructor, and such type of definitions are using more than one constructor definition within the same class is known as constructor overloading. So we have seen function overloading same way. So this is known as constructor overloading. Okay. Defining multiple constructors within the same class is called as constructor overloading. So here we have defined three different definitions for constructor. One is default, parameterized, and copy constructor. Okay, so which is called as constructor overloading. Okay, so is covered, and this is how we can use multiple constructor to initialize your object in different ways. Okay. This is all about your constructor, types of constructor, and how that constructor can be used. The example of constructor that we have seen. Okay, that's all about constructor, multiple constructor. Just now we have discussed. So this is giving an example for multiple constructors. Okay, so defining what parameterized and copy constructor. This is how your multiple constructors can be called. Okay. Concept is known as constructor overloading. So this is an example for your constructor overloading. I think there is no need to discuss that thing. Okay. So constructor with default argument also we have discussed. Now simply dynamic constructor or dynamic initialization is deciding which particular constructor definition is to be called. So deciding that thing is nothing but your dynamic initialization of object. At runtime deciding whether to go for parameterized constructor, default constructor, or copy constructor. So that is nothing but dynamic initialization. Now coming to dynamic constructor. So dynamic constructor is nothing but your within constructor we are using this new keyword to initialize the data member of that particular class. Okay. So here string is a class and length and name are the data members of class string, and this is what is the default constructor we are defining. So length is defined as 0 and your string variable name is getting initialized to this new character length. So this is we are creating a block of one character for this variable name. Okay. So same way here through some string variable we are trying to initialize the parameter that we are passing is the string variable. So we are getting the length of that string using string length and allocating those many bytes for this variable name and copying that s value into name. So dynamically we are allocating the memory for this data member name, and that is why this constructor is called as dynamic constructor. That's all, nothing new in this. Okay, it is as good as allocating a memory for the data member at runtime and then initializing that data member through this parameter that you are passing to the string variable. This is the complete class and the dynamic constructor represented. So the data members are the string variable name and length. Okay. So we are defining our own class string. Okay. So don't try to combine this string with the string object that we have studied. Assume that we are defining our own string class using the character array. Okay. So the data member of this string class is character array and length, as just now I said. And we are initializing length to 0 and name to a single character here through this default constructor. This is parameterized constructor. We are passing one of the string as a parameter. Okay, see here the character first. So this is character array initialized to string variable. This your name is the string object. Name 1 is the string object which is being initialized to the value of first. Okay, so here the value of s is first, the value of first, which is nothing but this string. Okay, and length of that this string we are getting using string length, and those many uh, characters will be allocated, or memory block will be, for those many characters the memory block will be created and will be assigned to this name variable, and then that name variable is getting initialized to the value of s, which is nothing but this. Okay, so this is how your dynamic constructor works, and this is simply joining those two variables, two string variables, and assigning that to s1. Okay, string copy name comma a dot name. That is simply joining two string variables. Okay, so this is how your dynamic constructor works. Just go through this example. If you are having any doubt, you can ask. Otherwise, we will go to the next part. Now we'll see how to define destructors. Just wanted to mention it is called dynamic constructor because we are using operator new to allocate memory for the data member of class string. Okay, that is why it is called as dynamic constructor. Okay, so it can be integer array also. Okay, we will come to that also. So I hope it is clear to everyone now. These two are the constructors, default and parameterized constructor. And this is a function, member function used to concatenate two string variables. Okay, through string object. Yeah, that's all. What the same thing here we are doing, getting the length of A object, getting length of B object, which is nothing but one string, another string, adding those, and the resultant length is assigned to the length variable. So creating a block, new block for this name, and then copying A dot name to name, and B dot name is concatenated with whatever is the name variable. Okay. So that's all about your join, and that is how here the join function is called and displayed. Okay. Now this is another dynamic constructor where we are trying to allocate the memory for runtime memory for matrix. Okay, so it is represented using two pointers, or even you can represent it as the two-dimensional array. It is one and the same. And here is the here how we are assigning those or allocating dynamic memory. So dimension, these are representing number of rows, number of columns. So d1 is getting initialized to x and y. So here your number of rows will be initialized first. Okay, so pointer is assigned the value which is similar to your d1. Okay, and then every row is initialized to the value of d2, which is representing number of columns. Okay, so first block is created for number of rows, and second is for every row we are deciding the number of columns. Okay, so this is how your matrix will be defined, run or initialized runtime. So here the class matrix data member is two-dimensional array. Okay, and that two-dimensional array is initialized through the constructor matrix. And simply once it is allocated memory, once the memory is allocated for this two-dimensional array, we can read or enter the values corresponding to matrix using normal two for loops and cin variable, and this is displaying the same thing. Okay, so this is how your dynamic constructor can be used for initializing two-dimensional array, read matrix and display matrix. Okay, now we have done with constructor, three types of constructor, and what do you mean by dynamic constructor. Okay, now how to define destructor for this. Okay, so destructor is simply defined like for any constructor here, the value is C++. We are initializing whatever is the okay, static we have not done with. But you can just remember the if a variable is defined as a static, the value initial value will be 0. Okay, and if you are creating here calling that default constructor, C++ will increase it to 1, 2 and 3. So it will simply count the number of objects, and simultaneously when the execution will be done, okay, so automatically it will call the destructor. Okay, so and it is just reducing the value of C. So here three objects are created. So 1, 2, 3. The C value is getting initialized to 3, and automatically you can see your destructor get called every time your object will be destroyed. Okay. So simply you have to write tilde test. Actually there is no need to define anything, but we have just seen that to check that our destructor is getting called. So this particular portion has been added. Okay. So I think no output represented over here, but you will get leaving block and then destructor message object number, and that object number will be displayed. That object number 3, then 2 and then 1. So it will destroy your object in the reverse way in which it has created. Okay. If the first one is created first, then that first get deleted at the end. So you can just check all these programs on your online compiler to know how destructor get called. Okay. So same way for deallocating memory. Okay. So delete A will be written. As we are using new keyword in our dynamic constructor, you need to use delete keyword to destroy the memory which is allocated through your dynamic constructor. Okay. That's all. That is the difference between your constructor and destructor, normal destructor and dynamic destructor. So dynamic destructor is used along with dynamic constructor. If new keyword is used in the constructor, so we are using delete keyword in destructor to delete the memory allocated for A. This is representing single dimensional array, 1D array. 1D array memory is allocated and it is deleted. Then the object will be destroyed. Okay. So that's all about destructors and constructors. So if you are having any doubt related to constructor and destructor, you can ask. Otherwise, we will now go to the next topic. It's already time is over. Okay. We will stop here. Let me know if you are having any doubts related to constructor, destructor, dynamic constructor, and dynamic destructor. Okay. So only thing I think you might have observed, destructors are represented using this tilde symbol before the constructor name. Okay. So tilde, test, and then the just empty bracket. Okay, so to represent destructor, so name of destructor is also same as name of class. So constructors are differentiated from destructor using this symbol tilde. Okay, so that's all about constructor and destructor. Also we have used the same concept in our program, third program. Okay, so that might have cleared an concept of constructor. Still, if anybody is having any doubt, you can ask. I'll download till that your attendance. And I think we should stop here for today. And tomorrow I'll start with static and dynamic